Welcome everybody to this presentation entitled Modeling Tunnel Junction for VCSELs, a self-consistent non-equilibrium Green's function drift-diffusion approach. I am Alberto Tibaldi from the Department of Electronics and Telecommunications of Politecnico di Torino, and this work has been carried out in collaboration with Chalmers University, Boston University, and the National Research Council of Italy. Before starting talking about tunnel junction VCSELs, it is probably useful to recall something about standard aluminum gallium arsenide VCSELs. The most important part of a laser of a VCSEL is the active region, in this case quantum wells, where the electrical carriers are converted into photons. The cavity is defined by a couple of mirrors implemented by distributed Bragg reflectors, or DBRs. One p-doped, one n-doped, because the device is a diode. Everything is grown epitaxially starting from an n-doped substrate, and then we have two contacts. The P1 from which current is injected, it flows here, and then it is collected at the N contact. There is still one piece missing, which is the oxide aperture. This is pretty useful both for focusing current just here and to provide optical confinement, so mode engineering for the VCSEL. Now, in this presentation, we are going to talk about something that concerns two specific parts of this device: the p-doped DBR and the oxide aperture. Why? Well, VCSELs right now are quite interesting in short-range data communication. Why short-range? Well, centralized computation paradigm suggests that most of calculations and traffic takes place inside data centers. So, optical communications shorter than 100 meters are very important. What is important is having low power consumption and high speed, but this to some extent is incompliant with Hall transport, because low mobility leads to higher resistivity, so more losses and a higher time constant of the device. Okay, this is quite relevant in aluminum gallium arsenide VCSELs, but this is absolutely fundamental in trinitride materials such as gallium nitride or aluminum gallium nitride. In these cases, maybe it is not even possible to p-dope. For instance, aluminum gallium nitride is almost impossible. The other thing that we would like to get rid of is wet oxidation, because it is the most difficult fabrication step of the device. Indeed, it can be hardly controlled along the radial direction because of the extreme oxidation velocity, and due to the composition gratings, it is not so predictable along the growth direction zeta. These are two good reasons to manifest some interest in tunnel junctions as hole injectors in the device. So, in this work we are not going to focus on a tunnel junction VCSEL, but just on a test structure focused on carrier transport. Grown on an n-doped substrate, we find a cladding and then some oxide layers. These are just because of the preliminary studies performed with this device, but of course oxide layers are not going to be necessary in the future. Then the main dish, the most important part of the device, is the only p-doped region, is the tunnel junction. You can see here that the p-doped regions are in red. Then we have the intrinsic layer mimicking the active region. We don't have quantum wells in this geometry because it is just a test structure. And then a buffer and the top contact. Both contacts, now notice, are n-doped. Now, The critical part of this device is the fact that the tunnel junction operates according to band-to-band tunneling. So we need, in order to study this device, for instance with a drift diffusion framework, a model describing somehow the band-to-band tunneling. The seminal work comes from Kane, 1961. Quite inspiring, but not directly applicable in drift diffusion codes because it gives some problems at equilibrium. However, this seminal work inspired several other Kane-derived local models, such as Hurks or Schenck. Here the equilibrium problem is fixed, and these models are quite consolidated in silicon devices, but they exhibit some numerical shortcomings, sometimes with other materials, so we didn't like to use them for our particular problem. Something interesting is given by non-local band-to-band tunneling models. Probably among the presently available modems, these are the best ones. But we would like to avoid using fitting parameters, and these models have a lot of fitting parameters. In this view, even if surely these models can reproduce the characteristics, probably they cannot be so predictive. I mean, they need some calibration. However, this paper is pretty suggested, even if focused on transistors, because it's a very good review of all these models. So, we are working in the framework of a drift diffusion solver, and in particular the usual Poisson equation coupled self-consistently to the electron and hole carrier continuity equations. Usual recombination rates, Shockley-Riddle, radiative, and Auger. And we use these discretized constitutive relations for current density, the Scharfetter and Gammel ones, which are pretty indicated because solve the numerical instability. However, the output of a drift diffusion, at least the one which is interesting for us, is the band diagram, so conduction and valence band and the Fermi levels. Let's focus just on the tunnel junction. Let's extract the band diagram and the Fermi levels defined from the drift diffusion ones, and we can study just this small portion of band diagram with Dyson's equation. As an output, we have, for instance, the retarded Green's function, which is something giving us information about all the available states in the device. This can be used inside the Keldysh equation, which gives information about the occupied states in the device, and so gives several other quantities, such as this is the space and energy resolved current density, but also the carrier density. Scattering, non-equilibrium Green's function, or this formalism in general, allows to keep into account of scattering, and you can see here this is the divergence of the scattering current in the device, that this is scattering is present especially in this region. Well, you solve iteratively these equations until the self-consistent Born approximation is satisfied, and this is the NEGF, non-equilibrium Green's function block of our solver. Now let's go back to the current. If we define a threshold, an energy threshold, for instance in the mid-gap, it is possible to distinguish electron current densities from hole current densities. We integrate them in space, we compute the derivative versus space, and we have a generation rate which is something that talks with drift diffusion. So we can plug it in the drift diffusion code, and we have a sort of a generalized outer loop which can talk iteratively with NEGF, and after convergence is achieved, we have the output. We applied this method to this device. We are interested in this actually because we have experiments. So these are the simulations performed with the NEGF-drift-diffusion approach, and these are the measurements. So very good agreement between the two. However, we can do much more than experiments with this framework, because we can use it to interpret our results. What I mean is, this is the output current from drift diffusion, and you can see that the whole current, basically the one injected from tunneling, is much lower than the electron current. This surplus of electron current is something that we don't want, because we need both electron and holes to perform non-radiative, to achieve radiative recombination. So from our perspective, this blue curve here is basically a leakage. Now, this is something that you cannot measure simply. Another thing that one can estimate is the impact of scattering. These curves are obtained with and without scattering. So, there are two informations here. One, the band-to-band tunneling in this device is basically ballistic. You don't need so much to insert scattering. It's a ballistic dominated mechanism. The second information is, notice that without scattering the curve is slightly lower, and it is a sort of like having an amplified tunneling current, meaning the ratios are almost the same. So it seems like that leakage is a sort of amplified tunneling current. Let's stay on this. If we come back to our band diagram, we can try to draw on it these two squares, and we can understand basically that this band diagram is almost equal to the one of a couple of back-to-back anti-series diodes. It is like having a base current given by a tunneling current, the flow of electrons going from right to left through tunneling, and this enables a much higher flow of electrons going from the extreme right towards the left. This operation recalls that of a phototransistor, where in a phototransistor we have that incident light photogenerates a base current which enables an electron flow. Here we have, instead of a photocurrent, a tunneling current, which is used as a based current and amplified. So this is not just something fashion, but it gives us interesting information about where we should touch to optimize this structure. In fact, we know that in a transistor, if we have high recombination in the base, the amplification is lowered. So we introduced 5 quantum wells to intercept some of base current. The other common practice is increase doping to increase gain, but we want to kill gain, and so we reduce the emitter doping. Then we introduce some electron barrier layer by thickening the p-buffer section, and even if maybe it's not the most optimized structure, what we can see is that here the current is dominated by the tunneling current, so by a bipolar current, even at 10 milliamp levels, so the ones comparable to those of a typical VCSEL operation. I repeat, this is not the purpose was not optimizing perfectly the structure, but just demonstrating how the analogy can help us towards the design. So my presentation is over. I would like to thank you for your attention. If you have some questions, I will be happy to try to answer them.